The flour had turned to paste beneath Sarah Alcott's trembling fingers, mixed not with water but with the salt of her tears as she worked the dough in the small kitchen of her father's bakery in Sheridan, Wyoming, on a blistering August morning in 1878. She had been crying for 3 days straight, ever since the bank had come with their notice of foreclosure, ever since her father's cough had worsened to the point where blood spotted his handkerchief, ever since the weight of keeping their small business alive had fallen entirely upon her 19-year-old shoulders. The bread needed making regardless of grief, regardless of fear, regardless of the fact that she had no idea how they would pay next month's rent or afford the medicine Dr. Morrison said her father desperately needed. Her hands moved mechanically through the familiar motions, pushing and folding, while tears continued their steady path down her cheeks and onto the wooden board below. The bell above the bakery door chimed, but Sarah did not look up. She could not bear to face another customer with red-rimmed eyes and a forced smile, could not pretend that everything was fine when her entire world was crumbling like day-old biscuits. She heard bootfalls on the wooden floor, the distinctive jingle of spurs, the creak of leather as someone approached the counter. Still she kept her head down, her dark blonde hair falling forward to hide her face as she worked the dough with increasing desperation. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep and gentle, tinged with a southern drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps Oklahoma. "The bakery is open, is it not?" Sarah drew in a shuddering breath and wiped her face with the back of her flour-dusted hand, succeeding only in leaving white streaks across her tear-stained cheeks. "Yes, sir. We are open. Just give me a moment, please." She turned to face the customer and found herself looking into the kindest pair of brown eyes she had ever seen. The man was tall, perhaps in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his worn Stetson. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, dusty from the trail, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was more than just another drifter passing through town. He stood at the counter with his hat now in his hands, his expression shifting from polite inquiry to immediate concern as he took in her obvious distress. "Madam, are you all right?" He took a step closer, then checked himself, as if aware that his presence might be unwelcome. "Forgive me for asking, but you seem troubled." Sarah let out a bitter laugh that caught in her throat. "Troubled? Yes, I suppose that is one word for it." She turned back to her bread, kneading more forcefully now. "What can I get for you, sir?" "We have rolls from this morning, some sourdough loaves, and these will be ready in about an hour if you can wait." The cowboy did not respond immediately. Sarah could feel his gaze on her, studying her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. She waited for him to state his order and leave, to let her return to her private misery. But instead, he set his hat on the counter and moved closer to the barrier that separated the customer area from her workspace. "I have traveled a long way," he said slowly, "and I have tasted bread in many towns, but I reckon I have never seen anyone put quite so much sorrow into their kneading. Makes me wonder if that tears are part of your recipe." Despite everything, Sarah felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "If they were, I would have enough to supply the whole territory right now." The tears started again, unbidden, and she angrily brushed them away. "I apologize. I am not usually so unprofessional. It has been a difficult few days. May I ask what troubles you so deeply?" The cowboy's voice was so genuinely concerned that Sarah found herself looking up at him again. There was no judgment in his expression, no impatience, just an open kindness that made something in her chest ache. "My name is Thomas Jensen, and I am new to Sheridan. I do not mean to pry, but sometimes a sympathetic ear can lighten a heavy burden." Sarah hesitated, her hands stilling in the dough. She did not know this man, had no reason to trust him with her problems, but there was something about him that made her want to speak, to let the words that had been building inside her for days finally pour out. Maybe it was because he was a stranger, someone who had no connection to her life or her circumstances. Maybe it was simply that she was too tired to keep everything locked inside any longer. "My father is dying," she heard herself say, and once the words began, they would not stop. "Consumption, the doctor says. He needs medicine, expensive medicine, and rest in a dry climate, but we cannot afford either. We have this bakery, this little shop that my father built from nothing when we came here 5 years ago, but it is not enough. We are behind on rent, behind on everything, and the bank has given us 30 days to pay what we owe or they will take it all. I have been trying to keep up with the orders, trying to bring in enough money, but I cannot do it alone. My father wants to help, insists on helping, and it is killing him faster. I watch him grow weaker every day and I am powerless to stop it." The confession left her breathless, trembling with the force of emotions she had been suppressing. Fresh tears streamed down her face, falling onto the dough below, and she no longer tried to hide them. Thomas Jensen watched her with such compassion that it almost hurt to look at him. "How much do you owe the bank?" he asked quietly. Sarah told him, the number sounding impossibly large in the small space of the bakery. $300 by September 15th. I have been trying to save, trying to build up our funds, but every time I get close, something happens. The oven needed repairs last month. We had to pay for a doctor's visit. My father needs food that will be gentle on his stomach, and that costs more than our usual fare. I feel as though I am trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teaspoon." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes thoughtful. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He walked around to the side of the counter, where a small gate separated the public area from the kitchen, and let himself in. Sarah started to protest, but he held up a hand in a calming gesture. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said. "But I have a thought, if you will hear me out." He approached the work table where she stood and looked down at the dough she had been kneading. "This bread here, made with your tears and your sorrow, I would wager it will taste different from any other bread in town. Not because the tears add salt, though perhaps they do, but because you are putting your whole heart into it. That is rare, Miss Alcott, Sarah Alcott, Miss Alcott. That is rare and valuable, but sorrow alone will not save your bakery or help your father. What you need is hope, and maybe a bit of help." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. "I have been working as a foreman on the Triple Bar Ranch southeast of here for the past 2 years. I have saved my wages because I had a dream of starting my own spread someday. I have enough to cover your debt to the bank." Sarah's eyes widened and she took a step back from him. "No, absolutely not. I cannot take your money, Mr. Jensen. I do not even know you." "Then get to know me," he said simply. "Let me help you save this bakery, and in return, let me come here each day to buy my meals and talk with you. Let me learn who Sarah Alcott is beneath all this sorrow. And when your bakery is thriving again, when your father has the medicine he needs, then you can pay me back. Not in money, mind you, but in friendship, in time spent together, in getting to know each other properly. Does that seem fair?" It was the most absurd proposal Sarah had ever heard, and yet there was something about the earnestness in Thomas Jensen's face that made her want to say yes. But practicality and pride warred within her. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What reason could you possibly have to part with your savings for people you do not know?" Thomas smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow more handsome. "My mother died when I was 12 years old," he said. "She was sick for a long time, and my father worked himself to the bone trying to pay for doctors and medicine. In the end, neither of them survived. My father died 6 months after my mother, and I believe it was from a broken heart as much as exhaustion. I was taken in by a neighbor, a kind man who taught me everything about ranching and treated me like the son he never had. He told me that the best way to honor my parents' memory was to help others when I could, to be the kind of person who lightens burdens instead of adding to them. When I saw you crying over that bread, I saw my mother in her final days, trying to keep our household running despite her illness. I saw my father, working until his hands bled because he loved her and could not bear to lose her. If I can prevent another family from suffering that way, then my savings are well spent." The sincerity in his words broke through Sarah's defenses. She found herself crying again, but these tears were different, mixed with something that felt almost like relief. "I do not know what to say. Say you will let me help." Thomas reached out and gently took one of her flour-covered hands in his own. "Say you will give me a chance to know you, and maybe sweeten this sorrow into something better. Say yes, Sarah Alcott." She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his long fingers wrapped around hers with such care, and felt something shift in her chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could not predict. But what choice did she have? Her father was dying, the bank was waiting, and here stood a man offering her hope when she had thought all hope was lost. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will let you help." Thomas's smile widened and he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Then let us start by finishing this bread properly. Show me what to do and I will help you. From now on, you do not have to carry this burden alone." For the next hour, Sarah taught Thomas Jensen how to knead bread, and it was the strangest and most wonderful thing that had happened to her in months. He was surprisingly adept, his strong hands learning the rhythm quickly, and he listened intently to every instruction she gave. They worked side by side at the table, their shoulders occasionally brushing, and gradually Sarah felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. He asked her questions about the bakery, about her father, about how they had come to Sheridan from Ohio 5 years earlier after her mother's death. She found herself talking more freely than she had in ages, the words coming easier in the presence of this gentle cowboy who seemed genuinely interested in her life. When the loaves were finally shaped and set to rise, Thomas insisted on paying for several rolls and a loaf of sourdough. He also asked if he could meet her father, and Sarah, feeling oddly protective and hopeful at once, led him to the small room behind the bakery where her father spent most of his days now. Robert Alcott was a thin shadow of the robust man he had once been, his face gaunt and his breathing labored. But his eyes were still sharp, and they studied Thomas with a mixture of curiosity and caution as Sarah made the introductions. "Father, this is Thomas Jensen. He is a foreman at the Triple Bar Ranch, and he has made me a very generous offer to help us with our financial difficulties." Robert's eyes narrowed. "What kind of offer?" Thomas pulled up a chair and sat down so he was at eye level with the older man, a gesture of respect that Sarah noticed and appreciated. "Mr. Alcott, I would like to loan your daughter the money needed to pay off the bank and to purchase medicine for you. The loan will be interest-free and can be repaid whenever your circumstances improve. In return, I ask only for the privilege of getting to know your family and perhaps sharing meals here at your bakery. I give you my word as a man of honor that my intentions are entirely proper, and that I mean no harm to your daughter or your business." Robert studied Thomas for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath, waiting. Finally, her father began to cough, a deep rattling sound that shook his whole frame. Sarah rushed to his side with a cloth, and when the fit passed, there was blood on the fabric. Robert looked at it wearily, then turned his gaze back to Thomas. "My daughter is precious to me, Mr. Jensen. She is all I have left in this world, and I would rather die in the street than see her harmed or taken advantage of." "I understand completely, sir," Thomas said. "And I promise you that I will treat her with nothing but respect and kindness. You have my word." Robert looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. "Do you trust this man? Do you want this?" She gave a small nod, and something like relief crossed her father's face. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Jensen, with gratitude, and I pray that the Lord will bless you for your kindness to strangers." That afternoon, Thomas Jensen walked with Sarah to the bank, and she watched in amazement as he paid off the entire debt without hesitation. The banker, Mr. Thornton, looked surprised but pleased, and he stamped their account as paid in full with a flourish. As they left the bank, Sarah felt as though a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and she could breathe fully for the first time in months. "Thank you," she said as they stood on the wooden sidewalk outside. "Thank you so much. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "I told you," Thomas said, his eyes warm, "your friendship is payment enough. But right now, I think we should visit the doctor and get that medicine your father needs. Then perhaps you could show me around Sheridan. I have only been in town a few times, always briefly, and I would like to see it through the eyes of someone who calls it home." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, first at Dr. Morrison's office, where Thomas paid for a month's supply of the expensive tincture that was supposed to ease consumption symptoms, and then walking through the streets of Sheridan. Sarah showed him the general store, the church where she attended services on Sundays, the small park by the creek where she sometimes sat when she needed a moment of peace. They talked constantly, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Thomas told her about his work at the Triple Bar, about the cattle drives and the open range, about his hope of someday owning land of his own. Sarah spoke of her love for baking, how she found solace in creating something nourishing and beautiful from simple ingredients, how she had once dreamed of expanding the bakery but had set those dreams aside when her father fell ill. "Perhaps you can dream again now," Thomas said as they sat by the creek, watching the water flow past. "Perhaps this is a new beginning for both of us." Sarah looked at him, this man who had walked into her life just hours ago and already changed everything. "Why do I feel as though I have known you longer than a single day?" "Maybe because some people are meant to know each other," Thomas replied. "Maybe because sometimes the universe brings people together at exactly the moment they need each other most." He reached over and took her hand again, and this time she did not pull away. "I want to be honest with you, Sarah. When I walked into your bakery this morning, I was not looking for bread. I was looking for you." She stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I saw you through the window 3 weeks ago when I was in town for supplies. You were laughing with a customer, your whole face lit up, and something about that moment struck me right in the heart. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since. I came back today hoping to meet you properly, and instead I found you in tears. But even crying, even in your sorrow, you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I know that sounds forward, maybe even improper, but I believe in speaking the truth, and the truth is that I think I started falling for you the moment I first saw you smile." Sarah's heart was racing, her mind spinning. This was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. And yet, when she looked into Thomas's earnest face, she did not see a stranger. She saw someone who had been brave enough to speak aloud what she was feeling but had been too afraid to acknowledge. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Then do not say anything yet," Thomas replied. Just let me court you properly, Sarah Alcott. Let me come to your bakery every day. Let me help you with whatever you need. Let me show you that not all the world is sorrow and struggle, that there can be sweetness too. And maybe, if I am very fortunate, you will come to care for me as I am already beginning to care for you. She should have said no. She should have been cautious, protective of her heart and her reputation. But sitting there by the creek with her hand in his, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in so long, Sarah found herself nodding. "All right," she said. "Court me then, Thomas Jensen, but know that I am not an easy woman to impress. I have seen too much hardship to fall for pretty words alone." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that made her smile. "Then I will have to prove myself through actions as well as words. Challenge accepted, Miss Alcott." They walked back to the bakery as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah felt different than she had that morning, lighter somehow, as though the tears she had cried into her bread dough had washed away some of the despair that had been weighing her down. When they reached the bakery door, Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that it made her blush. "I will see you tomorrow," he promised, "bright and early, ready to help with whatever needs doing." "You do not have to do that," Sarah protested. "You have your own work at the ranch. I have spoken with my boss, Mr. Harrison, and he has agreed to give me more flexible hours for the next few months. He is a good man, and when I explained the situation, he understood. Besides, I am a foreman. I have earned some privileges." Thomas smiled at her. "I meant what I said, Sarah. You do not have to carry your burdens alone anymore." That night, Sarah gave her father the medicine from Dr. Morrison, and she told him everything that had happened. Robert listened quietly, sipping the tincture that was supposed to help his cough, and when she finished, he reached out and took her hand. "He seems like a good man," Robert said, "but be careful with your heart, daughter. You have been through so much already." "I know, father. But I think maybe it is time to stop being so afraid. Thomas makes me feel like I can breathe again, like there might be happiness waiting for me if I am brave enough to reach for it." "Then reach, my dear girl," Robert said, squeezing her hand. "Reach with both hands and hold on tight. Life is too short and too precious to spend it in fear." True to his word, Thomas appeared at the bakery the next morning just as Sarah was starting the day's baking. He had brought fresh eggs from the ranch and a jar of honey, gifts that made her smile. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side to prepare the bread and pastries that would be sold throughout the day. Thomas proved to be a quick learner, and his presence made the work feel less like drudgery and more like something almost enjoyable. Over the following weeks, this became their routine. Thomas would arrive early each morning, help with the baking, and then stay to assist with customers and cleanup. In the afternoons, they would take walks together, exploring the countryside around Sheridan. Or they would sit with her father, reading aloud from newspapers or books that Thomas borrowed from the small-town library. Robert's health improved slightly with the medicine, enough that he could sit up for longer periods, and even venture into the bakery occasionally to supervise and offer advice. Sarah found herself looking forward to each new day with an eagerness she had not felt in years. Thomas was easy to be with, his presence both comforting and exciting. He made her laugh with stories from his ranching days, tales of ornery cattle and stubborn horses, and the characters he had worked with over the years. He listened when she talked about her mother, about the grief that still sometimes caught her by surprise, about her fears for her father's future. He never tried to minimize her feelings or offer empty platitudes. Instead, he simply held her hand and reminded her that she was not alone. As August faded into September, Sarah realized that she was falling in love. It crept up on her gradually, not in a sudden rush but in small moments. The way Thomas always made sure she ate breakfast before starting work. The way he learned exactly how she liked her coffee and had it ready for her each morning. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention. His eyes soft with an emotion she was starting to recognize because she felt it too. The way he treated her father with such respect and kindness, never making Robert feel like a burden or an inconvenience. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch of the bakery watching the stars come out, Thomas turned to her with a serious expression. "Sarah, there is something I need to ask you." Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I have been offered a promotion at the ranch. Mr. Harrison wants to retire, and he has asked me to take over as manager. It would mean more responsibility, longer hours for a while, and it would delay my plans to start my own spread. But it would also mean significantly better pay and a house on the ranch property. A real house, not just a bunkhouse room." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "I want to take the position, but only if you think we have a future together. Only if you can see yourself being part of that life with me." Sarah's breath caught. "Thomas, we have known each other for less than 2 months. I know, and if you need more time, I understand completely. But Sarah, I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of my feelings for you. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you put your whole heart into everything you do. I love how you care for your father, how you never gave up even when everything seemed impossible. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you hum while you are kneading dough. I love you, and I want to spend my life making you happy, if you will let me." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, but these were entirely different from the tears she had cried over her bread dough 2 months ago. These were tears of joy, of overwhelming emotion, of a happiness so intense it needed some way to escape. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you the moment you walked around that counter and offered to help me, and I have been falling deeper every day since. Yes, Thomas. Yes to a future together. Yes to whatever comes next, as long as we face it side by side." Thomas pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that was gentle and passionate all at once, full of promise and hope and love. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling so widely their cheeks hurt. "I want to do this properly," Thomas said. "I want to ask your father for permission to marry you, and I want to give you the courtship you deserve. I know circumstances have rushed us together, but I do not want you to ever feel that I took advantage of your vulnerability or your need. You deserve to be wooed and cherished and treated like the treasure you are." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Thomas Jensen, you have been wooing me every single day since we met. Every cup of coffee, every gentle word, every moment you have spent helping me and my father, that has all been courtship. And it has been more romantic and meaningful than any traditional courtship could have been, because it was built on genuine care and support when I needed it most. I do not need grand gestures or a long engagement. I just need you." "Still," Thomas insisted, "I will do this right. Tomorrow I will speak to your father, and if he gives his blessing, I will save up for a proper ring. We can be married in the spring when the weather is good and your father is hopefully even stronger. We can have a real wedding with guests and a celebration." But fate had other plans. That night, Robert Alcott's condition worsened suddenly. Sarah woke to the sound of his violent coughing and found him struggling to breathe. Thomas, who had been staying in the small room above the bakery that they used for storage, came running at her cry. Together they sent for Dr. Morrison, who arrived within the hour looking grave. "His lungs are filling with fluid," the doctor said quietly. "The medicine has helped, but the consumption is progressing despite our efforts. I am sorry, but you need to prepare yourselves. He may not have much time left." Sarah felt her world tilting again, all the joy of the evening evaporating in the face of this harsh reality. Thomas held her as she cried, his own face tight with sorrow. Robert lingered for 3 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, Sarah and Thomas sat with him, holding his hands and talking to him about anything and everything. On the 2nd day, Thomas formally asked Robert for Sarah's hand in marriage, and the dying man smiled with genuine happiness. "I had hoped to walk you down the aisle," Robert said to Sarah, his voice barely a whisper. "But I am glad to know you will be in good hands. Thomas, you promise me you will take care of my girl." "With my life, sir," Thomas said solemnly. "I promise you she will never want for anything, and she will always be loved and cherished. Then you have my blessing and my thanks. You came into our lives like an answer to prayer, son. I believe God sent you to Sarah when she needed you most." Robert turned his gaze to his daughter. "Do not wait, sweetheart. Do not put off your happiness waiting for a perfect moment. Life is too uncertain. Marry this man soon and live every day to its fullest. That is my wish for you." Sarah was crying too hard to speak, but she nodded, clutching her father's frail hand. On the 3rd day, with Sarah on one side and Thomas on the other, Robert Alcott took his last breath. He went peacefully, a small smile on his face, and Sarah felt as though a piece of her heart had been ripped away. Thomas held her through the initial storm of grief, and then he took charge of the arrangements, handling all the details that Sarah was too overwhelmed to manage. The funeral was held 4 days later at the small church Sarah had shown Thomas on their first afternoon together. Nearly the whole town came to pay their respects, testament to the kindness and generosity Robert had shown during his years in Sheridan. Sarah stood at the graveside in her black mourning dress, feeling Thomas's solid presence beside her, and tried to find comfort in the knowledge that her father was no longer suffering. In the weeks that followed, Sarah moved through her days in a fog of grief. Thomas was there constantly, a steady anchor when everything else felt unmoored. He helped her keep the bakery running, dealt with the legal matters surrounding her father's death, and simply held her when the sorrow became too much to bear. He never pushed her to talk about the wedding or their future, content to let her grieve in her own time. It was not until early November, as the first snow began to fall, that Sarah felt ready to think about moving forward again. She was in the bakery kitchen one morning, kneading bread as she had done 1,000 times before, when she suddenly remembered that day in August when Thomas had first walked through her door. She remembered her tears falling onto the dough, remembered the taste of sorrow that had infused everything she made. And she realized that her tears now, though still present, were different. They were tears of healing, not hopelessness. Tears that honored her father's memory while also acknowledging the life that still stretched before her. Thomas came in as he always did, carrying fresh supplies from his trip to the general store, and found her standing at the work table with tears on her cheeks, but a smile on her face. "What is it?" he asked gently, setting down his parcels and coming to her side. "I was just remembering," Sarah said. "Remembering that first day when you walked in and saw me crying over my bread dough. Do you remember what you said? That you had never seen anyone put so much sorrow into their kneading." "I remember. I was thinking about how my father told us not to wait, not to put off our happiness. And I realized that I do not want to wait anymore, Thomas. I have spent so much of my life being sad, being afraid, carrying the weight of worry and grief. But you taught me that life can be sweet too. You tasted my sorrow and somehow found a way to sweeten it, just by being who you are and loving me the way you do. I do not want to waste another day." I want to marry you and I want to start our life together now." Thomas's face lit up with such joy that it took Sarah's breath away. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured. We can wait as long as you need." "I am certain. My father gave us his blessing, and that means everything to me. I know he would want us to be happy, to embrace the life we can build together. So yes, Thomas Jensen, I am absolutely certain. Let us get married." They were wed 3 weeks later in late November, in a simple ceremony at the church with just a few close friends as witnesses. Sarah wore a dress of dove gray, still honoring her mourning period but allowing herself this moment of happiness too. Thomas wore his best suit, which he had purchased specially for the occasion, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, his kiss was tender and full of promise. Thomas had arranged for the use of the house on the ranch property that came with his new position as manager. And after the wedding, they moved Sarah's essential belongings from the rooms behind the bakery. The bakery itself Sarah leased to a young couple from Ohio who had recently arrived in Sheridan looking to start a business. She kept a share in the profits and maintained the right to use the kitchen whenever she wished, but the daily operation would now be handled by others. It felt right, a way to honor her father's legacy while also allowing herself the freedom to begin her new life. The house on the Triple Bar Ranch was small but cozy, with a bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting room, and even a front porch that looked out over miles of open rangeland. Thomas had spent weeks preparing it for her, painting and repairing and making sure everything was perfect. The first night they spent there as husband and wife, he carried her over the threshold and set her down gently in the middle of the sitting room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Home," Sarah repeated, testing the word. It felt right in a way that nowhere had felt since her mother died. "Yes, this is home now, our home." That winter was one of the coldest in recent memory, with snow piling high and temperatures dropping so low that the water in the washing basin would freeze overnight. But inside the little house, Sarah and Thomas created their own warmth. They learned each other in 1,000 small ways, navigating the adjustments and compromises that came with sharing a life. Thomas continued his work managing the ranch, often rising before dawn and coming home after dark during the busiest periods. Sarah kept herself occupied with cooking and maintaining their home, and she baked regularly, sometimes taking her creations to the bunkhouse to share with the ranch hands, who declared her to be the best cook in Wyoming. She missed her father terribly, especially during the holiday season, but Thomas was patient with her grief, understanding that healing was not a straight path, but something that would have its ups and downs. He held her when she cried, listened when she needed to talk about her memories, and reminded her that it was all right to also feel happiness alongside the sorrow. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah began to feel different in the mornings. There was a queasiness that would not subside, a fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activities. When her monthly courses failed to arrive, she realized with a mixture of joy and terror what was happening. She was carrying Thomas's child. She told him one evening in early April as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She had been nervous all day, uncertain how he would react to this news that would change their lives once again. But Thomas's response was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of pure joy, swept her up in his arms, and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby. Sarah, this is the most wonderful news. Thank you, thank you." "I did not do it alone," she teased, and he laughed, a sound of such happiness that it made her heart soar. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Sarah's body changed and grew, and Thomas treated her as though she were made of spun glass, constantly worried that she was doing too much or straining herself. She found his concern endearing even when it bordered on excessive. He talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child stories and promises about the life they would have. He painted a small room in their house in cheerful yellow, transforming it into a nursery with a cradle he built himself from wood he had carefully selected and sanded until it was smooth as silk. In late August, exactly 1 year after the day Thomas had first walked into the bakery and found Sarah crying over her bread dough, she went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon. Thomas stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement and love. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Thomas had tears streaming down his face. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Sarah's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Sarah looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and his flailing fists, and felt a love so fierce and immediate that it stunned her. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." They named him Robert Thomas Jensen in honor of Sarah's father and his own, a name that connected past and future. Little Robert, or Bobby as they quickly began calling him, was a good baby, content and curious about the world around him. Thomas was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor during colicky nights without complaint. He would sit in the rocking chair Thomas had made, holding Bobby and singing old cowboy ballads in his deep voice, and Sarah would watch them and feel her heart might burst from the fullness of her love. The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were harsh winters when supplies ran low, and everyone on the ranch had to pull together to survive. There was a year of drought when the cattle suffered, and Thomas worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the ranch profitable. There was scarlet fever that swept through the region, and they lived in terror for weeks until it became clear that Bobby had been spared. But through all of it, they faced everything together, their love deepening with each shared trial and triumph. When Bobby was 3 years old, Sarah gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace, who arrived early one morning in May with surprisingly little fuss. Thomas was beside himself with joy at having daughters, and he doted on them shamelessly. Bobby took his role as big brother seriously, helping his mother with the babies and proudly showing them off to anyone who would look. As the children grew, Sarah taught them to bake, passing on the skills her father had taught her. The kitchen of their little house was always full of the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Thomas taught Bobby to ride and rope, and to the surprise of many, both girls insisted on learning as well. Thomas had no qualms about teaching his daughters the same skills he taught his son, believing that everyone should know how to handle themselves on a ranch. By the time Bobby was 10 and the twins were 7, Thomas had saved enough money to purchase a parcel of land adjacent to the Triple Bar Ranch. It was the dream he had held on to for so many years, and seeing it come to fruition was deeply satisfying. He built a larger house on the property, one with enough room for their growing family, and for the future he hoped they would continue to build together. They named it the Sweet Sorrow Ranch, a reference to the bittersweet way their love story had begun, born from Sarah's tears but transformed into something beautiful. Sarah continued to bake, and her bread became famous throughout the region. People would travel for miles to buy loaves from the woman who, as the story went, had once kneaded her tears into the dough and been rewarded with the love of a good man. She always smiled when she heard the tale repeated, knowing that the truth was both simpler and more complex than the legend suggested. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas and Sarah took a trip back to Sheridan, leaving the children in the care of trusted friends from the ranch. They visited Robert Alcott's grave together, and Sarah laid fresh flowers on the headstone. "Thank you, Father," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me not to wait, for giving me your blessing. I hope you know how happy I am, how good my life has become." Thomas stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, and together they stood in the quiet of the cemetery, honoring the man whose death had been one of the catalysts for their life together. That night, they stayed at the hotel in Sheridan and talked long into the evening about everything they had experienced together. They spoke of the early days of their courtship, of the fear and uncertainty that had marked that time. They talked about the children, about the ranch, about their hopes for the future. And they marveled at how far they had come from that August morning when their lives had intersected in a small bakery, when tears had fallen into bread dough, and a cowboy had tasted sorrow and decided to sweeten it. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Sarah asked. "You said that maybe some people are meant to know each other, that the universe brings people together at exactly the moment they need each other most." "I remember," Thomas said, pulling her close, "and I still believe it. You needed help and I needed purpose. You needed hope and I needed someone to love. We were exactly what each other needed, precisely when we needed it." "I was so broken then," Sarah said softly, "so convinced that life was nothing but struggle and loss. I could not imagine that happiness was possible for me. And now," she smiled and kissed him, a kiss that held all the love and gratitude and joy she felt. "Now I know better. Now I know that life is both bitter and sweet, sorrow and joy mixed together like ingredients in bread dough. And I know that having someone to share it with, someone who loves you and stands beside you, makes all the difference. You did not just help me save the bakery, Thomas. You saved me." "And you saved me right back," he replied. "Before I met you, I was drifting through life, working hard but toward no real goal beyond someday, maybe owning my own place. You gave me something to work for, someone to be better for. You and the children, you are my purpose, my joy, my reason for everything." They held each other as the night deepened around them. Two people who had found each other at their lowest point and had built something lasting and true from the ashes of sorrow. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the expected rhythms of ranch life and family. Bobby grew into a fine young man, tall like his father with his mother's determined spirit. The twins developed distinct personalities despite their identical faces. Emma was quiet and thoughtful, drawn to books and learning, while Grace was adventurous and bold, always ready for the next challenge. When Bobby was 15, Sarah gave birth one final time to another son they named James, who became the baby of the family and was thoroughly spoiled by his older siblings. Thomas's Sweet Sorrow Ranch prospered over the years. His reputation as a fair and knowledgeable rancher spread throughout Wyoming, and his cattle consistently brought top prices at market. But he never allowed success to change who he was at his core. He remained the gentle, kind man who had walked into a bakery one morning and offered help to a crying woman, who had been willing to give up his savings to ease a stranger's burden. Sarah continued to be the heart of their home, creating a place where love and laughter were as plentiful as the fresh bread that was always on their table. She taught her children about kindness and resilience, about facing hardship with grace and celebrating joy whenever it appeared. She told them stories about their grandfather Robert, keeping his memory alive for the grandchildren he had never met. And she told them about the day she had been kneading bread with tears in her eyes, and how their father had tasted her sorrow and decided to sweeten her life. "Love is not always a thunderbolt," she would say. Sometimes it is a gentle hand reaching out in a moment of need. Sometimes it is someone choosing to stand beside you when they could easily walk away. Your father gave me his help when I needed it most, but more than that, he gave me his heart. And in return, I gave him mine. That is the greatest gift two people can exchange. As Bobby prepared to leave home to attend university in the East, determined to study agriculture so he could return and help manage the ranch with modern techniques, Sarah felt the bittersweet pang of watching her children grow up and begin their own lives. But she also felt pride and satisfaction, knowing that she and Thomas had raised good, capable, loving children who would go out into the world and make their own marks. The twins, now 18, were planning their futures as well. Emma wanted to be a teacher, to open a school on the ranch property where children from the surrounding homesteads could get a proper education. Grace had announced her intention to become a veterinarian, a bold choice for a woman, but one that her father fully supported. Little James, now 10, showed signs of being a natural horseman, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and care. On a warm evening in late summer, with the children all occupied with their various activities, Thomas and Sarah took a walk out to the ridge that overlooked their property. They stood hand in hand, watching the sun set over land they had worked together to build into something lasting. "Do you have any regrets?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Any wishes that things had been different?" Sarah thought about the question seriously before answering. "I wish my father had lived to see his grandchildren grow up. I wish my mother could have met you. I wish the road here had not been quite so hard with quite so many tears." She paused, then smiled. "But no, I do not regret any of it, because all of it, the sorrow and the struggle, the loss and the fear, all of it led me to this moment, to this life with you. I would not trade a single day of what we have built together. Even those early days when you were crying over your bread dough, especially those days," Sarah said, "because those were the days when you found me. When you looked at a broken, desperate woman and saw someone worth helping, worth loving, you could have walked away. You could have bought your bread and gone on with your life. But you did not. You chose to stay, to help, to love me even when I could not see past my own sorrow. That choice changed everything." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and they stood together as they had so many times over the years, drawing strength and comfort from each other's presence. "I love you, Sarah Jensen. I loved you the moment I saw you, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Thomas, my cowboy who sweetened my life." They stayed on the ridge until the stars came out, talking and laughing and remembering. They spoke of that first meeting, of those early days of courtship and the whirlwind of events that had brought them together. They talked about their children and their dreams for the future. They made plans for the years ahead, for the grandchildren they hoped would someday fill their home with new laughter and love. As they finally turned to walk back to the house, lights glowing warmly in the windows, Sarah thought about how her father had told her to reach for happiness with both hands and hold on tight. She had done that, had reached for Thomas and for the life they could build together, and she had never let go. The sorrow that had once defined her days had been transformed, not erased but woven into the fabric of a life that held so much more than just pain. The bread she made now was never tasted of tears, only of love and care and the satisfaction of work done well. But she never forgot those loaves she had made on that August morning 20 years ago, never forgot the salt of her tears mixing with the flour and water. Those tears had been real, her sorrow valid, her fear justified. But they had also been the beginning of something beautiful, the dark threads in a tapestry that made the bright ones shine all the more brilliantly. Years later, when Thomas and Sarah were old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren who filled the Sweet Sorrow Ranch with chaos and joy. They would still sometimes talk about that first meeting. Their grandchildren would beg for the story, wanting to hear again about how Grandma had been crying and Grandpa had been brave enough to ask why, how he had given up his savings to help strangers, how love had grown from an act of kindness. And Sarah would tell them, her voice still strong despite her age, "Your grandfather taught me that sorrow does not have to be the end of the story, that tears can water the ground where new happiness grows. He tasted my sorrow and decided to sweeten it, not by taking the pain away but by giving me something to balance it. He gave me hope and love and a future I could not have imagined. And that, my darlings, is the greatest gift one person can give another." Thomas would smile and take her hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as they had that first day by the creek, and he would add, "And she gave me purpose and joy and a reason to be the best man I could be. We saved each other, your grandmother and I. That is what love does. It does not rescue you from life's hardships. It gives you someone to face them with, hand in hand, until the bitter becomes sweet and sorrow transforms into joy." The Sweet Sorrow Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through their children and their children's children. The story of its founding, of the woman who cried into her bread dough and the cowboy who offered to help, became part of family legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart, it remained a simple, true story about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose love in the face of sorrow, and who built a life together that honored both the bitter and the sweet. Sarah lived to be 83 years old, sharp-minded and silver-haired, still baking bread in the kitchen of the ranch house and still holding Thomas's hand as they sat on the porch in the evenings. Thomas lived to be 85, his body worn from years of hard work but his spirit as strong as ever, still looking at his wife with the same love and wonder he had felt that first day in the bakery. When Sarah finally passed, quietly in her sleep on a spring morning with Thomas beside her, the entire community mourned the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness and resilience. Her funeral was held in the same church where she and Thomas had married, and people traveled from across the territory to pay their respects. Thomas stood at her graveside with his children and grandchildren around him, and though tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, he also smiled, because he knew how blessed he had been to share 53 years with the woman he loved. "Thank you," he whispered to the heavens. "Thank you for letting me taste her sorrow and sweeten her life. Thank you for every moment we had together." He lived another 2 years after Sarah's death. Years he spent sharing stories with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ensuring that Sarah's memory and the story of their love would not be forgotten. When he finally joined her, he was laid to rest beside her in the small cemetery, their headstones side by side, marking the final chapter of a love story that had begun with tears and ended with a legacy of joy. On Thomas's headstone, beneath his name and dates, his children had inscribed a simple epitaph: "He tasted sorrow and made it sweet." And on Sarah's, equally simple: "She kneaded with tears but baked with love." Together, the stones told the story of two lives intertwined, of sorrow transformed, of love that had endured through decades and trials, and would continue to echo through the generations they had created together. The bakery in Sheridan, though it changed hands many times over the years, never lost the story of the woman who had once cried into her bread dough. Some said that if you bought bread there on certain mornings, you could still taste a hint of salt, a reminder of tears and sorrow. But others said no. What you tasted was sweetness, the lingering essence of a love that had transformed pain into joy, bitter into sweet, darkness into light. And perhaps both were right. Perhaps the best things in life, the most meaningful and lasting, always carry traces of both the bitter and the sweet, the sorrow and the joy. Perhaps that is what makes them real, what makes them matter. Sarah and Thomas had understood this, had built their life on the foundation of that understanding, and in doing so, they had created something that would endure long after they were gone. The Sweet Sorrow Ranch still stands today, operated by the 6th generation of Jensens, and above the door of the main house hangs a plaque with the words Sarah spoke to her grandchildren so many years ago. Sorrow does not have to be the end of the story. It serves as a reminder to all who see it that darkness can be transformed, that tears can water the ground where new happiness grows, and that sometimes, just sometimes, love arrives exactly when we need it most, in the form of a kind cowboy who walks into a bakery and decides to stay.